Well, it's now 4 o'clock, and this is the Great War Discussion Group. We have today David Pendleton, who has been a scholar of World War I for some time, in addition to being a volunteer. He's made a particular study of the 35th Division, which has strong ties locally in Kansas and Missouri. David, go ahead.
Okay, just a little bit more background. Coming up in February will be my 18th anniversary of volunteering at the museum. I was actually a World War II historian before I started becoming a volunteer. And so I began reading about a book a week on World War One. And I said, if I'm going to do that, I might as well get a master's. So I did get a master's in military history about a decade ago. And when I could, I always wrote about World War One. And my master's capstone paper thesis was on the 35th Division. And my advisor was Michael Nyberg from, at the time, University of Southern Mississippi. So about a decade ago, also, I got a position with University of Kansas Osher Institute that puts on classes. And so I produced a 6-hour content for that. And so you're going to get that 6 hours in less than an hour because we all know the basics of the war, I hope. Just some general quotes about the division. This is what John J. Pershing thought of the division when they arrived in France. And this is historian Edward G. Lingle. The 35th got a reputation of being not a good unit in the one because of the one battle they fought in. And Edward Lingle here, he carried that forward in his book also. Basically, his comment is that the 35th Division was a bunch of hayseeds from Kansas and Missouri, and they couldn't be good soldiers because their minds were slow to work. Now, Robert H. Ferrell is a former professor at the University of Indiana, and he's made a career of bashing the 35th Division. He's written several books, and each one of those, he really lets the 35th Division have it. And basically, he blames their poor performance because they were a National Guard unit. And hopefully, at the end of this, you'll get the impression that maybe that being National Guard was not the problem of their performance during the battle at the Meuse-Argonne. Here's another quote from Ferrell. The original commander was General Wright, and we'll talk more about him later. He actually left the unit and took over the 89th Division, which was also from the Midwest. And the Germans considered the 89th Division one of the 4 best divisions that the Germans faced during the war. Just a little bit about the structure. Most of you all should know this if you've done any reading on the war. Now, what was interesting about the 35th Division, that the original people came from the Missouri National Guard, over 17,000 of them, and over 7,000 from the Kansas National Guard. and then they were combined in to make the 35th Division. They also received a couple of thousand draftees. Now, originally the companies were 150 soldiers or so, and that is what the towns in Kansas and Missouri tried to recruit to. And then when they got down to Fort Sill, or by the time they got to Fort Sill, the units had been changed companies to 248 men. So they had to combine units to reach that number. And so they ended up combining Kansas and Missouri units together to arrive at the 250 or so in each company. Just a quick timeline. The Kansas and Missouri National Guard were mobilized at their home stations in early August of 1917. And then on the 20th of August, they were mustered into federal service. By the 24th of September, some Missouri units were in Camp Clark near Nevada. And then by the 25th of September, they were at Camp Donovan, Oklahoma. This was a sub-camp of Fort Sill, Oklahoma, which is the home of the artillery today. By about the end of September, the 1st of October, all the units were at Camp Donovan, and they were started on the 8th of October to work a 16-week training program. And then in April of 18, the unit started deploying to Europe. This is William M. Wright, the original commander for the 35th Division. This is a photograph of Camp Donovan. It was just a tent city on the plains of Oklahoma. Not a tree in sight, as you can see. So let's talk about life at Camp Donovan. First of all, General Wright was not there most of the time. The unit was in Fort Sill. General Pershing had all the commanders come over to Europe, supposedly to make a recon, but mainly it was for him to get a picture of them in his head. Pershing couldn't control who the commanders were when they were in the United States, but once they got to Europe, he could do what he wanted. And he was a stickler on having generals that looked like generals. In other words, he didn't want any overweight people. There was only a couple overweight officers who were allowed to have. One was Hunter Liggett, and then his supply guy. But other than that, he wanted to be lean, mean fighting machines. While he was gone in Europe, the guy in charge was the artillery officer for the brigade artillery officer. And one thing he did, he was active duty, and he didn't like the National Guard officers. So he tried to get as many of them fired as possible. There was over 100 of them that were fired during that 16-week period. And Truman barely made it through by the skin of his teeth. He had to study a whole lot because he was an artillery officer, and artillery requires a lot of math, and Truman was our last president without a college degree. One of the big things that they always had daily retreat inspections. They were trying to make them into soldiers. You could call that they had excessive police call. Many soldiers wrote home in letters complaining about they were, doing police call instead of training. Now, this winter of 1917-18 was one of the coldest on record in that part of Oklahoma, according to the locals. The soldiers lived in tents, and if you're lucky, you had a heater in the tent. They had to break ice to wash in the morning. Lots of times to wash their clothes, they washed those in the river. They had to break ice to do that. While they were at Camp Donovan, there was a meningitis outbreak, and that quarantined a bunch of the soldiers, and they couldn't train. They had artillery issues. I'll go into more details later, but they didn't have enough artillery equipment to train on. Same way with communication issues. They didn't have radios to train on. Wednesday afternoons and Saturday afternoons were uniform and equipment maintenance days because the soldiers had only one uniform, so they had to keep it maintained. And the training schedule was filled up with a lot of drill, a lot of weapons qualification, and a lot of bayonet practice. This was the official Army War College training schedule. And as you can see, 223 hours of that 16 weeks was spent at the rifle range. Another 105 and a half hours was spent on drill and ceremony. And then almost 60 hours was spent on trench warfare and 44 hours on bayonet training. As a reminder, as we know, about 60 to 70% of all casualties during the war were from artillery, 20% from machine guns, 5% from rifles and pistols, 5% from gas, and about 0.33% in the British Army for bayonet wounds, and that was actually only 0.25% in the American Army. So they spent a lot of time on bayonet practice for something that probably wouldn't happen that often. On the 9th of April, they began their movement to Camp Mills by train. They arrived in Europe by ship, or they traveled to Europe. They arrived in Liverpool in early May, and then they took a train across England, got on ferries, and then arrived in France. One thing that happened on this part of the trip, though, is that they received some replacements from Fort Dodge, Iowa. And the soldiers from Fort Dodge, Iowa brought diphtheria with them. And so when they arrived in England, over 40% of the trained soldiers were quarantined and not allowed to go forward. Here's some more more of their schedule. The plan was for every unit to receive 4 weeks of unit level specific training in the country. The only unit that actually got this was the 1st Infantry Division. No other unit got it. One of the big things that Pershing thought was very important was the individual soldier and his rifle. He thought that everybody should be an expert with their rifle. And that originally was the M1903 Springfield. When they arrived the first unit they was put with was with the British Army for training. The British Army didn't have the ammunition for the Springfield, so they exchanged their Springfields for the SMLE. And once they got that, they spent the next 3 weeks at the rifle range making sure they were experts with that. And then all of a sudden they got transferred to the French Army for training. The French Army didn't have the ammunition for the SMLE, so they were given the M1917 Enfield. Those are the 3 rifles. Well, they're very, I guess you could say they're similar. They all had specific techniques with themselves to make sure. So they each time they got a new rifle, they would spend 2 to 3 weeks making at the rifle range, making sure they could all shoot. As we all know, the French provided the artillery, the machine guns, the horses and mules, airplanes, and tanks to the American Army. The artillery, as I said, they hardly didn't have the artillery back at Fort Sill to train on, and what they had to train on was not what they would use in France. When they got to France, the unit was over 1,000 horses and mules short. And here's a list of some issues that came about because of all these things that have happened so far. The first one that I didn't really talk about, though, was the 117th Field Single Battalion was from the Missouri National Guard, and they were pulled out and given to the 42nd Infantry Division, the Rainbow Division, as a Missouri contribution to that. And they were an elite outfit. They got several unit accommodations and so forth. I talked about the meningitis outbreak out, and then Camp Dodge replacements that brought the diphtheria. Now, they're over in France now, and all of a sudden, somebody comes around looking for people that could drive vehicles. And if you raised your hand that you could drive, and you wanted to, you could leave the division and go be a driver in either the supply of service or the tank corps. Once they got to France, they got each of the companies got 40 replacements to replace that loss of 40% from the meningitis. The soldiers were sent to AEF schools to do that. So the people that would train the soldiers normally back at their unit were busy being trained themselves. And then all of a sudden there was a muster for stateside training officers. And they lost over 100 officers sent back to the United States. And most of these were married soldiers that were selected to go. The loss of officers in the battles caused NCOs to be commissioned. And once you were commissioned, you were transferred to a different unit. So if you were an NCO out of the 35th Division, you got transferred out once you got your commission. And then the 4th Command and General Staff College quota came down, and the 35th Division had to send its officers to that, even though it was right before the start of the St. Michael offensive. Now, the personnel policies of the Department of the Army, or War Department, caused some problems. One, Major General Wright was gone for most of that training, so he wasn't there for it. And once he got the unit to Europe, he was pulled out to temporary Corps Command. And when he was sent back to Division Command, they didn't send him back to his old division, but sent him to the 89th instead. Only about 40% of all regular Army officers and NCOs went deployed overseas. 60% were back in the States, and their job was mainly to make sure that the units there, became soldiers, and they weren't. It was more about dress than it was about how to survive in combat. Now, the 1st Division had caused some issues, is because they were the first one over. They got to handpick their officers out of the officer candidate schools. that were going on at Plattsburgh and so forth. And so they got the best of the best from each class, 15 to 20. We talked about the 256 person companies. And then one of the issues is that there was no company medical personnel in a division or in the division structure and the battalion structure. So therefore, units had to evacuate their own wounded from the battlefield. This is more information on the 60th Field Artillery Division issue. They were missing 1,200 of their draft animals. They didn't even receive a single heavy artillery gun until January 18. They didn't get any observation topographical equipment until Europe, and they trained away from the 35th Division, so they didn't even train with their own division. The 110th Field Signal Battalion was the replacement for the one that went to the 42nd. They had no equipment at Camp Donovan, so all they did was PT, physical training, most of the time. The inspectors said that they were in excellent physical shape. They were the last unit to arrive in France, and they didn't link up with the 35th until middle of June. They didn't pull out their equipment in their boxes until they got into their positions for the Meuse-Argonne battle. So they didn't even know how to operate their equipment, really. They had helped French signal units in the Vosges Mountains, but never operated on their own. This is the new commander of the 35th Division, Major General Peter Traub. He was a West Point officer. He was at West Point at the same time as Pershing was. I won't say they were friends, but they knew each other at West Point. West Point was fairly small at the time. And he was a cav officer commanding an infantry unit. We know that we have the same Battle of St. Michael and the Battle of Meuse-Argonne. And those took place within 2 weeks of each other. And the reason is that Foch wanted to cancel St. Michael completely, but Pershing wouldn't do that because he had too much sunk cost into it. So he told him, "I'll do both," and so they did. So they did the first battle, and then a week later or so, they got into the second battle. Now, the selection process of what units were used for the St. Michael offensive and for the Meuse-Argonne, I don't really know, but the headquarters for the AEF treated each division like it was interchangeable parts, even though some divisions had experience in battle and some didn't. Here's Traub again. And the 35th Division was in reserve at St. Michael, never fired a shot, never got deployed like that. So now they're on the move to their positions for the Meuse-Argonne battle. And Traub fires his 2 brigade commanders, who are both National Guard officers who've been with the unit, with the division since August of the previous year. He fires them on the move. So the units are walking during the night and hiding in the woods during the day, so any German aircraft can't see that they're moving to the Meuse-Argonne. And so, since the brigade commanders were fired, a regimental commander had to move up to take brigade command, and then a battalion commander had to move up to regiment, and so forth. So a lot of commanders didn't even know their staff, and staff didn't know the commanders for the battle. Here's Brigadier General Lucien G. Berry. He's that regular Army field artillery officer that was in command down at Fort Sill. There he is on his horse. He is a piece of work. besides trying to get all the National Guard officers firing, he does not like General Traub. General Traub and him don't get along. And even though their command posts are less than 100 yards apart from each other, they don't communicate orally. They communicate through memorandum, is the way they communicated. So, just to let you know, at this point in time, here is the commanders of the unit. What I'm showing here in the different colors is that if it's in red, they've been around for a long time. If they're in blue, they've been around for about 6 months. And if they're in yellow, they don't have that much time in their position. We had some people that were working above their pay grade. The Field Single Battalion was commanded by a major instead of a lieutenant colonel. Same way with the motor supply train. Here's the infantry and the artillery. As you can see, the firing of the two commanders on the 21st of September caused a lot of chain reaction. Two of the four artillery units, their commanders have been around a while, and actually the 129th Field Artillery Regiment is probably one of the most effective artillery units of the four indirect fire units in the division during the battle. Okay, here's more on that Barry character, General Barry. He also told his units to slow down their firing or cease firing because of the possibility of the barrels overheating. And another thing he did is that he refused to coordinate observation with the Army Air Corps. He was like old school and airplanes were new, so he wasn't going to use them. Here's the staff signal officer for the for the division. He's another regular Army officer, but he's actually a coast artillery officer by training. He was assigned to the division, and the division never opened their equipment boxes from their arrival in country till just before the attack. There's two types of wire that he could have ordered. One is waterproof, one is non-waterproof. Of course, he ordered the non-waterproof type. Okay, we're getting up ready for the battle here. There's 3 corps online. The 35th Division is a part of 1st Corps. Once again, the red means that these guys are experienced. They've been in at least 2 battles. Blue means they've been in at least 1 battle before this. And green means they are in their first battle. The most important objective here is circled. And that's been assigned to the 79th Division, another green division. The easiest mission is the 33rds. They only had to go out about 5 miles and then protect the right flank along the river. Here's a schematic that shows that. Here's the actual division order from the 35th Division. Really can't see what's there. Here's another schematic of it. The line of departure is at the bottom of the map, and eventually the 35th Division reaches Exermont, which is at the top of the map. Here's the battle formation going into the first day of the battle. The 69th Brigade is in the lead with with 2 regiments. The 70th Brigade is in reserve with 2 regiments. A more detailed look at this. The 2nd Battalion of the 139th Infantry has been attached out of the reserve, and their job is to wipe or clean up Vauquois Mountain or Vauquois Hill during the battle. This unit was not even part of the brigade that they were traveling with. So in the Army, we like to think are supposed to be KISS, keep it simple, stupid. And this plan was probably not that way. Once again, that map again. Okay, they attack on day 1. The 137th Infantry Regimental Commander has a nervous breakdown. And so the 139th Infantry Regiment passes his unit through it. So by the end of the night on the 26th of September, each brigade now has 1 brigade in contact, or 1 regiment in contact, and 1 regiment in reserve. It's about 6 miles from left to right on the map, and about that same depth also. Lieutenant Colonel Ristine is supposed to be a battalion commander, but he's been moved up to command the 139th Infantry Regiment. He is leading from the front, as he's been told by General Traub. Officers lead from the front, and he is leading from the front, and him and about a dozen of his soldiers get surrounded by the Germans. They hide in a shell crater, and then when night falls, they sneak out. And Colonel Ristine, instead of going back south, he heads west and crosses into another division zone. It takes him about 48 hours to get back to the 35th Division. So there's that formation again on the night of the 26th. Okay, so on the 27th, they attack again. And then on the 28th of September, they do a 3rd attack. And the 137th has been told, they've now realigned it. So the 69th Brigade has swapped out the 137th and the 139th from each other. So they've never trained this way, but now they've swapped it out. During this time period, the first 4 days, the division has made 2 daytime attacks and 2 nighttime attacks because Pershing didn't like how fast the 35th Division was going. Now, sometime when you're up in Memory Hall, check out the 35th Division board up there, and it shows the forward progress of the 9 divisions on the before they were relieved, and you can ask yourself if they actually were the slowest moving unit on the battlefield. After the 5th battle, or the 5th offensive attack, the unit is basically decimated because they're ahead of everybody else. They're receiving fire from 3 directions. The Germans send in 5 divisions to stop them, and they are pushed back from Exermont to a place called Bonny Hill. They had gained 12.5 kilometers before retreating, and that was the furthest of the 9 units at the time. They were relieved by the 1st Division. Now, the 1st Division commander immediately asked Pershing for a 24-hour pause before they attack again. Pershing grants this, even though the 35th Division asked for the same thing. They had fired the chief of staff, and a full colonel came down from AEF headquarters to take over the chief of staff job. And the first thing he asked Pershing, who he knew personally, was to give him 24 hours to reorganize. And he refused. But when the 1st Division commander asked for it, he got it. The 1st Division suffered 1,000 casualties during that first 24 hours during that pause. So the 35th Division comes out of the battle. They have not had any hot chow for a week. It's been raining for an entire week. They've conducted 5 attacks, 2 at night in 5 days. And on their way back, they pass an AEF inspector. And this AEF inspector has gotten out of his vehicle and is dressed, sharp, as and he starts yelling at the soldiers because they hadn't shaved and hadn't, their uniforms looked messy. And a lieutenant colonel from the 35th Division basically tells the major to shut up. And so this major goes back and writes a report. It's called the Drum Report, and we'll get to that in a second. One of the things about this is that after the 1st Division fought at Cantigny, they did an after-action report of July 1918, and almost every problem the 35th Division faced was what happened to the 1st Division at Cantigny. So evidently nobody passed that AAR down to the 35th Division, or if it did, it never got to anybody to use it. Their casualties were higher slightly than the other divisions, but not that much. Traub was not fired. During this battle, Pershing fired division commanders and even corps commanders because they weren't advancing fast enough, but Traub didn't get fired. Traub probably had a nervous breakdown on the battlefield. He was seen waving his swagger stick at the air at one point in time. So after they went back, they reorganized, got cleaned up, and then did some training, and they were selected for another offensive, which didn't happen because of the armistice. Now, the post-war treatment is where a lot of this negative stuff came from. Oh, I lost that. Okay. I lost my 17 things that he talked about. Okay, in the Drum Report, one of the major issues was about the communications. But the communication officer was a regular Army officer. Another one was the artillery commander. He was also regular Army. The third one was one of those 17 points of the report was the commander and his chief of staff should never leave their headquarters together, or never be out of their headquarters together. Well, Traub was a regular Army officer, and the first chief of staff was not, but the second one was. That came from the AEF headquarters. the casualties were officer casualties were very high, especially in the lieutenants and captains, and that's because they were leading from the front because that's what Trump told them to do, even though the 1st Division AR said not to do that. They also said there was a lot of straggling during the battle. But a lot of times the straggling was people that were going get ammunition or rations for their soldiers, type thing. When the battle ended, here at Bonny Hill, there was only one true battalion that was still solid, and that was Major Rieger's battalion. But everybody else fell in on Bonny Hill, and that's where they were at when they were relieved during the battle. Now, there was an investigation conducted by the military about the 35th Division and congressional investigation. General Traub was only a temporary 2-star general, regular army. He had been knocked back to colonel after the war was over with. So Colonel Traub appeared before the Congress, and basically he didn't defend his soldiers or anything else because he was still looking maybe to get a permanent promotion to general. Part of the investigation was the Kansas governor got involved. The Kansas governor at the time had served as the YMCA leader, head man for the 35th Division. And he won the election for the Kansas governorship without ever running a campaign. In fact, he was over in France when he was elected governor. And he was very upset with the reports that were coming out about his division, the 35th type thing. There was also things written about them in magazines, and that were negative about the 35th Division. And this all continued up through to 20 years ago, when even Commander General Staff College students were writing papers. They were still talking about the poor performance of the 35th Division. Now, as I said before, is that what started out as a National Guard division, by the time September of 1918 rolled around, it was no longer a National Guard division. Most of the unit, it was a mixed unit, probably 1/3 Guard, 1/3 regular Army, and 1/3 Army of the United States draftees type thing. I've done a special study of the unit from my hometown. I have found the names of 500 people or 500 soldiers on the roster between between April of 1917 and November of 1918. So they had this was actually before August of 1918. So they had over 100% turnover in their unit before they even got into their first battle. And out of the 150 soldiers or civilians that originally signed up to join the unit from my hometown, only 50 of them were still on the roster when they went into battle. Now, this is just quick and down and dirty. I normally do this in 6 hours. So, any questions?
David, let me start off with a question about their firearms. Your comment that they use the British rifle, was that the British rifle that was produced in American armories? Because the Americans produced a lot of British SMLEs, And when the war came along, when the U.S. entered the war, they started manufacturing them, chambering them for the same cartridge as the Springfield, so they didn't have as much of a supply problem.
Yeah, all I know is that when they joined the British Army for training, they had to turn in the rifle that they had been on since September of 17 until they arrived in Europe. And then Pershing thought the rifle and the soldier was still so important, even though that wasn't the killing weapon of the war anymore. And some units, would nod their head and do their own thing, but the 35th Division, said, "Oh, Pershing says we got to be experts, so let's go be experts." And so they would spend their time at the range instead of doing other training. And then they took them away from. It was less than a month later that they pulled them out and moved them to a French sector, and so they had to pick up that third weapon, and they went to the range again. So they kept on doing individual rifle marksmanship instead of spending time in other training areas that might be more important and more useful on the battle.
You said the group that came from your hometown started at 500, and by the end of the war, they were down to only 10% of the original guys.
No, originally there was 150 guys.
Okay.
There was 150 guys because that was the size of a National Guard company. They were combined with a unit out of Missouri, Trenton, Missouri, and 150 guys. So that's 300 guys, but they only need 258 or 256. So they also had overage of officers also because they had twice as many they did. They only kept the most senior officer, and that was a major from Missouri, because he was higher than the captain from my hometown. And that captain actually went to a machine gun unit. That's probably the reason he survived, or he wouldn't be here, or he wouldn't have lived through the war. So out of the 160 some that came from Missouri, he kept 150 to him of them. So basically, he probably got rid of his problem children, and so there was only 100 Kansans in the unit initially. Now, as they went through training and they got on the ship, and 40% were lost to diphtheria and stuff, they got over to France, and at that point in time, they asked for those drivers. And I think a lot of the ones from my hometown said, "Shoot, I joined with my buddies. I'm not going to fight with these guys from Missouri." So if they could drive a vehicle, they raised their hand and left. So by the time August of 1918 come around, I counted 500 names on the rolls of various daily morning reports for that company in that time period between April of 1917 and August of 1918. So basically, and out of all those, the people that went in the battle, there was only 50 Kansans, the original Kansans that were in the 268 by the time that first battle occurred. Mark, did that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Unit cohesion is not a term I think we would use with regards to this group.
Oh yeah, and you got to remember this is 1914. It was not that long after the Civil War. There was still some negative feelings between the Kansas and Missouri, and the 139th was where the 137th was all Kansan units that got combined, and the other two were all Missouri units that got combined. But the 139th was the one that had to be Kansan and Missouri's combined together to come up with the right numbers. So the 139th Infantry had had some probably some competition or dislike for each other because they're from Missouri and we're from Kansas or vice versa.
And we can still see some of that to this day, and I can imagine what it was like 100 years ago. Bruce Hubbard, thank you for joining us from England, and you had a comment.
There we
There
are.
you go.
First of all, thank you very much indeed for allowing me to join you. And I found that fascinating. But it seems from limited knowledge, you've got a division here that is made up in the States, 16 weeks training, which is not a lot, much of which is spent bayonet training. Then they suffer casualties from meningitis. The unit commander is not there. He's in France. They land in France and lose men to diphtheria. They have to get used to 3 different weapons. A number of men leave to become drivers elsewhere. Anybody with any experience as an officer is then sent back to the States to train others. And yet, when this division goes into action, it's criticised. This seems to be dreadfully unfair. Has there been, excuse me, some effort to redress the balance?
Well, actually, that's what my master's capstone thesis was about. Was to, I wrote, I forgot how long it was. It was quite lengthy. Trying to rehabilitate the reputation of the 35th Division. There was actually a Command and General Staff College major that wrote about him, and he blamed the issues on internal problems. While there was internal problems, a lot of the problems were also external. So why Pershing allowed Traub to fire 2 brigade commanders after the Battle of St. Miguel on the way to the Meuse-Argonne is beyond me. I just don't. I don't see how you would fire. They've been in command for a year. So what did they do while they were in reserve at St. Miguel to get fired? On the way to their first battle. Makes no sense.
Very good. Well, thank you all for attending.